Install a package, it doesn't remove it from your scripts, so you need to check that as well. Today, we'll be learning about the Events Common Core module in Node.js, and more specifically, how to both emit custom events and how to respond to those events when they are emitted. Right now, we're picking up where we left off in the last tutorial about NPM modules. And if you didn't see that tutorial, you can just catch up by installing the dependencies you see right here. So for production dependencies, we have the date.fns module and the UUID module. You could also refer to those as packages. Also, as a dev dependency, we have NodeMon installed. And then in the scripts, of course, the start script is node index, but what we would use in development is the dev script, and that is NodeMon index. So if we type npm run dev, it will launch NodeMon, and NodeMon will listen for the changes in our files and restart the server without us constantly having to type that. So again, if you didn't see the previous tutorial, just update your package JSON and npm installs to this. And if you don't know how to do that, please do watch the previous tutorial. Okay, let's move over to the index.js. And you can see we're already importing format from the date.fns module. And then we're also importing UUID, and it's actually v4. There's different versions in the UUID. So we're importing v4 as, this is an alias, as UUID. So we can call that right here. And you can test these out with these console log statements that we had from the previous tutorial. But what I want to do right now is rename this index file. So I'm going to right click and choose rename, and I'm going to name this log events in camel case JS. So this is a complete different file, and I'm going to make this into a module that we import into an index.js that we haven't created yet. So we need both of these imports, but we're going to make a logging function. Of course, logging events is something that's very useful on a server. Let's go ahead and also import the fs module. So we'll require fs. And then we're going to want to use promises. So let's say fs promises, set this equal to require fs and then dot promises. And we also need the path module. So here's require path. And now that we have all of the imports we need, and notice these are the only two that we really needed to use npm for, because these are all Common Core modules here that we imported. Now that we have that, I'll get a couple of extra lines. Let's go ahead and define our log events function that we can export. And it's going to be an async function, and it will receive a message parameter. Now inside the function, we need to define, we'll call it date time, and let's set this equal to, and let's just grab this format that we have right here and copy this, because that's what we essentially need. I'll use a template literal, and inside here I'm going to paste the format, the new date, it's got the tab, and then it will just end the template literal and leave it at that. And then we're going to take another definition here and call it log item. And we'll really use the date time. So I'll put another template literal. And we could have done this all in one line, but this gets kind of long if we do that. So I wanted to break it up. And so we've got the date time. Then I'm going to put another tab. And remember, there's a tab in here too. So what we're doing is creating a tab delimited log file. And now I'm going to use UUID and call that to get a unique ID for each log event. And then one more tab, and we'll just put in the message. There we go. And now that we have our log item, let's go ahead and log that to the console so we can see it while we're in development mode here as well. And now we need a try catch block. Let's get to the async await portion of this function. And we'll catch an error if an error happens, and let's just log the error to the console. If we have an error writing to the log, we won't be able to write the error to the log, so this is the best thing we could probably do right there. But in the try block, we can await fs promises and then let's go ahead and append file. If you remember from our tutorial on working with files, append file will also create a file if it doesn't exist. And now we need to use path, and we use path join and 2 underscores, and then we'll use the directory name value, and then let's put it in a logs folder, and after that let's call this event log.txt. And then we still need to pass in the content that we're going to put in the log. Right after that parentheses, we need the comma, and that would be our log item that we defined. Okay, now we can save this much. Now, I am thinking of something that could cause an error in the future, and we'll get rid of these console log statements down here, but I want to leave it like this for now so we can actually test out getting the error as well, or catching the error. So let's do module.exports and set this equal to log events. Now we're exporting our log events function, and we'll be able to use it in the index that we're going to create. So over in the file tree, we'll create a new file called index.js. From here, let's go ahead and define log events and set it equal to require, and now /, because this is once again a custom module, not a Common Core module or an NPM module. And so / log events. And now we're ready to work with the events Common Core module. And what we want to do is define an event emitter. And let's set this equal to events, the Common Core module events. After that, we need to define a class. So class myEmitter, and it's standard to capitalize instead of use lowercase on the first my there for a class. And then we want to say extends event emitter. And then we can just have the empty curly braces right here. This is, I know it looks strange, but it's directly from the docs as well. From here we can initialize the object that we're going to create. So we want to create myEmitter, but now, whoops, this needs to be a lowercase m to start out, so don't let it change on you or select the option that would select the previous myEmitter. And now that we've got myEmitter defined, let's set it equal to a new object that is myEmitter right here. So we've initialized the object. Now I know that's a little confusing, but that's what it looks like in the docs, so I just stuck with that. And then we've got add a listener for the log event. So then we can say myEmitter .on, and that is how we listen for an event. And I'm just going to call this a log event. We could be listening for any event we want to. This is the first parameter of listening for an event. So we just say which event we're listening for. And then we can call this anonymous function to pass in the parameter message. And now inside this anonymous function, we'll call log events, and once again, send that message that was passed in. So now that we are listening for the log event, we need to go ahead and emit the event to test this out. Now I want to set a timeout, which will hopefully let us understand how everything is processed a little bit better, but we're just going to emit the event. You don't have to have a timeout to do this. I just wanted to put a little delay in there. So once again, we use myEmitter.emit now, not on. On is listening, so emit is emitting the event. Now we'll emit the log event, and then let's go ahead and send our message. And I'll just say log event emitted. That looks good. Now let's put a delay in here with the timeout, and I'll put 2 seconds. That may be too long, it may not be long enough to see the difference. It just depends how long it takes NodeMon to restart the server. So now that we've got that saved, and this is our index, let's go ahead and open a terminal. You can do that from the terminal menu, or I do control backtick. I'm in Windows. And now I'm going to type npm run dev to launch NodeMon and our index.js. And we get an error, so let's see what we got. I did expect to get one. Notice we did log to the console. So here's what we would have written to a log file. We've got the date, we've got the time, we've got the unique ID, and we've got our message log event admitted. So that all worked out as expected, but we have an error, and let's see what it says here. Console error is not a function. Well, I should have typed console log here. Let me go back and fix that. We definitely have another error that I was expecting to see, so let's drop this back down. And of course, NodeMon should restart after I change this. So instead of console error, let's put console log. We might have to restart NodeMon. Let's see. Yep, now it restarted, and we can see the message that I was expecting to get. So here, once again, we got the log file, and then we got no such file or directory. And that is because append file will create the file if it doesn't exist, but it won't create the directory. And we didn't have a logs directory yet. So we need to modify our function, because if you think about this, when you install some software, there may not be all of the directories created that you need. So let's modify this try block to account for not having that logs directory to begin with. If you notice, we haven't used the fs module yet. We had used fs promises. So in the try block, let's say if, and then we'll say not, if it not exists is what we're going for here. So fs.exists sync, and then we want path.join, 2 underscores and directory name, and then we're just looking for the directory. So if this does not exist, essentially is what we're saying, then as you might guess, we want to create that. So we'll say await, and now use fs promises. Oh, and then we need dot mkdir, which is make directory. And we can say path.join, once again, 2 underscores in the directory name, and create the logs directory, please. So now, if the logs directory does not exist, it will create the directory, and then it will either create or append to the event log file. So let's make this change. And now, if we look back, we can see we got no error on this latest execution. Once again, everything wrote to the console. And now I'll bring this down. And if we look over here, we have a logs folder, and we have an event log, and there it is. We wrote to the event log. Now let's go ahead and run the program again. We'll need to make a change of some sort to do that, and then we can check the event log. So let's just make a quick change here by putting in a console.log, or no, you know what? We don't need to do anything like that. We could even just put in a comment, say testing, save, and we should be able to see some changes once again. If we go back to the event log, oh, we've got another problem. After our message, we didn't put a line break. And so then it just wrote the next log on the same line. So we need to put in a line break after that as well. So let's go to our log events, and where we define our log item at the end of message, then let's put a line break with a /in, and now this should make a difference. Let's check the event log again. And maybe it made a difference. I'll tell you what, let's try this. I'll just delete this altogether. Now the file doesn't exist. I'll get rid of the testing. Save. Write the file. Let's look at the file. There it is. Now, back here, once again, I will undo, put the testing back, and save. And let's look at the event log. There it is. We've got another log event emitted on a new line, and everything is lining up as we expect. Delete testing again and save. And there it wrote a third line to the log. So this is working as expected. So here is a abstracted log events function that you could use. You could accept more than one parameter as well. And if there was a second parameter here, when we would be in the index.js, when we emit this, we would just need to put the next parameter right here. So there can be more than one parameter as well. And this is how you set up an emitter to not only listen for, but to emit events. Now there might be all sorts of actions that you want to emit events for. When we create a web server, We're wanting to emit events to show what requests came in and log all of those so we have some detail of the activity for our web server. And that's what we'll be building next, a web server with Node.js. Today, we will be building a web server with Node.js. No framework will be utilized, and this will help us learn more foundational knowledge about Node.js. And then in future tutorials, I will introduce the Express.js framework. We're picking up right where we left off from the last tutorial about the Node.js events module. So let's go over some quick changes and file additions, and I will be providing a link to a GitHub repository in the description below. Okay, in the package JSON, you can see I have changed the name to 05 tut for the 5th tutorial in this series. You can change that whatever you want. Now, I've also got server.js instead of index.js as the main file, and I have changed the scripts accordingly. So it says node server and nodemon server instead of node index and nodemon index. Other than that, we still have the same dependencies as the last tutorial. So date fns and uuid are here, and the dev dependency of nodemon is here. And those are the few changes for the package JSON. Of course, I have renamed the index file to server.js. You can see everything else is currently the same here in the server.js file that was previously the index.js file, and we will come back to that. I want to delete the event log file that is currently in the logs folder. You can leave the logs folder if you want to. If not, it will be recreated. And that's because we still have the same log events.js from the last tutorial here as well. And we might make a change to that, but I won't do that now either. We'll come back to the whole events topic. What I do want to show you are the other folders and files that I've added. And these are simply to be served by the server so we can make sure it's working. I've got a style.css file. In the data folder, I've got a data.json and a data.txt, and you can just put in whatever information you really want to and style the page or web pages however you want to. I've got one image in here. Again, you could download the repository and get exactly what I have, or you can use your own. And then in the views folder, I've got a 404.html, an index.html, and a new-page.html. And I also have a subdirectory named subdir, and in this subdirectory is another index.html that will be the default page for this subdirectory route. And so we're going to serve all these different file types or content types from the server today. Now let's make some changes and additions to the server.js file. I'm going to eliminate some of these blank lines, and then when we created a class myEmitter that extended the event emitter in the last tutorial, it got kind of weird when we initialized our object and it was also named myEmitter. So I just want to name the class emitter, and this is just kind of for my peace of mind. After that, we can get rid of that extra space too. We will leave all of this here. I'm going to get rid of the comments about the listener. I'll also get rid of the timeout that we added because that will not be needed. And I'm going to comment out both of these right now, and then we'll come back to those later on when we need them. Give a little space in between. Now let's go ahead and import the Common Core modules that we'll need for this file at the top. And the first one we need is HTTP. And so that's one we haven't covered yet that we will today. And we just require HTTP. After that, we need path, and we'll require path. And we'll also need FS for the file system, so we'll require that. I spell require. And we're also going to need FS promises. So that equals require FS, but then at the end dot promises. And those are the Common Core modules we're going to need. And now we need to define a port for our web server. So not only will it have the address of localhost because it will just be a development server on our local machine, but we need to say what port it will be on. And so now we'll just define port in all caps, definitely a constant here. And we should say process.env.port, because if we were to host this somewhere, it would use this information. And then we can say or, and I'll say 3500 today. I've seen different ports used. And so today we'll be using port 3500. If we were to host this somewhere, it would have a different value here. Now that we have defined the port, let's go ahead and create the minimal server. We can do that by defining server, and let's set it equal to http.createServer. And now that gets a request that we'll just call REQ and a response in a function. And now we have our request and response headed into the server. And we won't really do anything here at first, except let's log the request.url and let's log the request.method. We're not quite ready to launch our server yet because it still needs to listen for requests. So we say server.listen, and this should always be at the end of your server.js file. And we give the port value, and then we have an anonymous function, and here we'll just say console log, and inside this console we'll use a template literal, and we'll say server running on port, and then let's once again give the port value here. And that's really all we need. So once the server starts, we can see this message, and I'll go ahead and press Alt-Z to make it wrap so we can see it. I've got Chrome open over here so we can eventually request a page as well. And we should see this statement in the console once we start our server. I'm going to go ahead and save the file and then open a terminal window by pressing Control and the backtick. You could also do that from the terminal menu that's hidden behind the 3 dots right now in my Visual Studio Code. And now let's go ahead and start the server by typing npm, I need lowercase there, run dev, and this will start nodemon that will listen for changes, and the server should start up. And we can see that we now have server running on port 3500. It's not going to serve anything. We're not sending any type of response back yet. We're not using the response, but it will log the request in the request method. So let's go ahead and type localhost 3500. And notice in the console, we've got the request here, which is just the slash, and then the method is a GET request, not a POST request or a PUT request or a delete request, but a GET request. And so we did successfully log those requests, but there's just nothing that comes back yet. I'm going to go ahead and press Control-C for now because we don't need to run the server while we're making a few changes. And now, of course, it can't serve a page, but that's no worry. We'll be serving a page soon. What we can do is talk about what else we could put in the server. And so after we're logging the URL and the method, and the URL was just the slash as we requested the index page, what we could do is build a path and then serve the file. So I'm just going to copy some code in to discuss it, but this is not what we'll want to do, and I'll discuss why. I'm going to go ahead and expand Visual Studio Code for now too, so we don't have to wrap the lines. But we could listen for a specific path. So we're defining path here. We've got 2 semicolons, we just need the 1. And if it is just the slash, or even if we specified index.html, either one of these would work, and this is an if statement, then we could set the response.status code to 200, which means successful. We could set the response header content type to text/HTML, because we would be serving the HTML page. And then we could go ahead and use path to define the path value and look in our views folder for the index page that we have right there and serve that page. And how we would do that would be to read the file that we currently have. And I didn't bother with handling the error in this version, but what we would do is read the file and take this data and then send the data. and we would be sending the contents essentially of the index.html file. This would work, but this is not efficient. We would have a statement for every address that came in, and actually every file, because of course we'll be serving some files that are not text HTML. And feel free to try this version out. I'm going to show another version that we will not use, but that you would also see in a possible simple server, and I'm just showing part of it here. I guess I could go ahead and close it out. But we could put in a switch statement, and we could look at the request URL value that comes in, and here if it's just the slash, we could go ahead and once again set the status code, set the path, read the file, and then of course break out of our switch statement, and we would have to have a case for every value that came in, even a duplicate case essentially if this were to be index.html and not the slash. And this would also be very big, and you would have to think of every possible file that could be requested. Your default could of course be the 404 if it doesn't exist, but this also takes up a lot of space, and once again it's not dynamic, and so this is not what we want to do today either. A switch statement is useful though, so let's take a different approach. Well, we will still use a switch statement as we construct what our server does today. So we'll start out, once again, let's keep the console log statement with the request URL and method. That could be useful as we monitor things during development. And then let's look at the extension of the request URL that we get. And so we can use the path.extName method to get that extension. So let's just pass in the request URL. Now once again, if it's a slash, maybe there will not be an extension name, but then we can handle that as well. So now that we've defined the extension, let's also define content type. And now we will use a switch statement to set the content type. And I'm going to paste this in because we'll be looking at all the different possibilities for file extensions. So there's several, and now we can go over this. But what we see up here above is we set our extension, and then we define content type with a let. At least we begin the definition, and then we can set it in the switch statement. So here we're looking at the extension, and now if it's .css, we set the content type to text/CSS, and we break. And we go on and do this for every type of request that we expect to get, or file content type that we expect to have requested. And you can see there's a couple of different images here. We've got an image/JPEG and an image/PNG. Text for text/plain. We also have JSON, which is application JSON. So all the different types of files we expect to serve. And importantly here, the default is the text/HTML, because this could not have an extension at all. It could just be the slash, or it could have the extension of .html. And so we just handle that as the default. Okay, the next part, if you have not worked with chain ternary statements, you may not like me too well right now, but I do like chained ternary statements. So I will paste one in and explain it. What I want to do is set the value of the file path. And now a chain ternary statement like this one can be confusing, especially if you haven't worked with them much or if you have worked with them at all. But let's break it down. We're saying that whatever the result is will be saved here in the variable file path. So we say if the content type is HTML and the request URL is just a slash, then this will be the value. And we set the path name using the views directory, as well as the full path name here we get from the dir name value, and we set it to index.html. But if that's not the case, then we look at the next condition, and that next condition is here, and we're saying, okay, if it's an HTML file type or content type, then if the last character in the request URL is a slash. Now this accounts for our subdirectory possibly, and not just the main directory. And so this would be just a little different because we not only need the views in the file path, but we need the request URL that would specify the subdirectory. And so this is what happens if that is true. And then if not, we go ahead and just check now to see if the content type is HTML at this point, since these other two were not true. And then we would look at whatever was requested in the views folder, because that's where the HTML should be. However, if that's not the case, then we're going to go ahead and just use the directory name or the file path and the request URL, because this could be CSS or an image or something in one of the other folders that would be specified in the request URL. So another way to break this down is everything that starts with content type is a conditional statement, and everything here that starts with path is a result if the previous conditional statement is true. And then the final one, the final path, because there's two paths in a row, is just the default if none of the others were true. And so you could break this out into an if, else if, else if, else statement if you want to do that. I prefer chain ternaries myself, and that is what we end up with. Let's go ahead and add one more statement here for the file path, and this will be an if, and we'll say if there is no extension, which means it was probably a slash and didn't have a file extension, and the request URL.slice -1, which is the very last character of the request URL, is not equal to a slash. So maybe we've just requested a file like about or new page. We have a new page over here, but we didn't type the .html afterwards. Well, this will make that work anyway, and sometimes that's cool to do. So this wouldn't really be required, but we're just making our addresses work even if we don't add the .html at the end. So then we'll just say file path plus equals, and then we'll add the .html here. So we still serve the correct file, although we might not have typed in the .html in the URL bar in the browser. So we should probably add a note to this, and I'll just say, whoa, I went too far. Here we go. Makes the .html extension not required in the browser. And that's what that statement is for. Okay, now we have our file path and content type, so we're ready to actually check and see if we want to serve the file. And we can do that with defining file exists and setting this equal to fs.exists_sync, and let's just pass in the file path, because now we are checking to see if this file exists or not. So this will be a true or false value that we get back. And we can check that by saying if file exists. We don't need to say if it's true, we're just saying if the file exists, then we're going to serve the file. But if it doesn't exist, we also need to have an else. And there are possibilities if it doesn't exist. This could be a 404, or this could be a 301, which is a redirect. Now we still aren't serving anything yet. We have determined our file path and we have determined our content type, but this is where we would serve the appropriate files right here. For now, let's just go ahead and log to the console, and what I want to log here inside of the else is the path.parse that will tell us the different parts of the file path. And let's go ahead and pass file path in and take a look at a file path that doesn't exist. So we need to start the server again. I'm going to go ahead and change this so we can see the browser as well. And then I'll open a terminal window. And now let's go ahead and type npm run dev. And the server is running. We can reload first and just make sure we get the home page. Well, I guess we won't get a home page, but we can make sure the request goes through. There we go. And so we'll add the home page very soon. But let's go ahead and look for something that doesn't exist at all, because the file does exist. So when it checked, it didn't get into that else area. Let's just say this is old right here. Okay, there was something that didn't exist. I'm going to expand the terminal window up so we can see this broke out now. And we can see Using the path.parse, we get these different parts of the file path. And what we're interested in right now is the base. Notice it's old.html. Even though it didn't exist, that's what we get because it was added in the file path. So that's what we're going to use as we come into this area that does not know if the file should be a 301 or a 404. And we'll determine that with a switch statement. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this and just change that console log now into a switch. And now instead of just path.parse.filepath, we want to put .base at the end of that. So that would be that value. And then we get our curly braces for the switch statement. We don't really need the semicolon there. And we need to put our cases in here. So our first case would be old-page.html. And this is an instance where we had an old page and we want to redirect it to the new page that we see over here in our file tree. So let's handle this redirect first. And this will be response.writeHead. And then a redirect is a status code of 301. And now we need to go ahead and put in the value here for the header. And this would be location. And then the location is /new-page.html. And now that we've handled the redirect, we need to go ahead and end the response. And after we end the response, well, we need a semicolon there. We break out of the switch statement there. And now let's add our next case. Our next case is going to be another redirect. And it's www. You had more redirects to put in here, but the default should be the 404. And so this is where we're going to serve a 404 response. And let's save this. Once again, I'm going to expand Visual Studio Code because that was wrapping a little weird. But here you can see what we have. Now we're currently not ready to serve the new page or the home page yet. We haven't got anything else being served, but we did handle the redirect. So what we need now is a function instead of repeating the same function here for a 404 or up here for other files, a function that we can call in both spots. Okay, let's scroll back up to define our function, and we will put that before the server and after the port. So let's call this function serve file because that's what it will do. It will need to be an async function. And then it's going to need the file path, so we can grab the file that's needed. It's also going to need the content type, so we can set the content type that is going to be sent. And it's going to need the response object to go ahead and send that response. So now that we have our parameters defined and we have the name of the function, let's go ahead and start by defining the try block. We already know it will be an async function, so there will be a try and a catch. So we can use await as we get the information we need. Let's go ahead and set the error block first. So we'll log the error to the console. And then we also want to set the response.status code. This would be 500. It would be a server error here if we could not read the data from the server that we want. And then we need to end the response. Notice I called the parameter the full word response before we were sending the res for response right here. And that's what we will pass in as we get down there further. But in the function, I'm using the placeholder here as the parameter with the full word response. And now in the try block, let's get the data from the file. So let's define data and set this equal to await fs promises and then dot read file. And now we need the file path to read, and we'll use UTF-8. And after we read the file and we are awaiting that information, we can use response and then write head. And inside write head, we'll go ahead and say 200 status code, and then the content type, there we go, content type, will be equal to the content type value that we have passed in. And then finally, we'll have response.end, and we can just send the data back. Now, some of you may be thinking ahead, and there are some problems that we will have with this, but this is the very basic to start out with. So I want to do that first. Now let's go back down into the code and call the function where it needs to be. So after we have the file path and the file exists, here we say serve the file. So this is where we would call our serve file, and this should have the file path value, should have the content type value, and it needs the response object. And notice here it's res because that's what it's defined as to begin with, not in the function definition of serve file, but what we're using in the server. Okay, let's just copy this and we'll make some changes below as we want to serve a 404 here. So I'm going to paste this in and then we'll just change a few values. Okay, here we know exactly what file we want to serve. So we're going to use path.join and pass in the directory name, and then we know it's in the views folder, and then we know it's the 404.html file. And we also know the content type, so we can just set that to text/HTML right away. And then once again, we need to pass in the response object. So let's save that as well. Now I'm going to resize Visual Studio Code again, and we'll go ahead and scroll down. And it looks like, of course, NodeMon's already working. And yes, the requests are coming in, and we served our 404 already because old doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and back out of here and see if we can serve the index. And yes, the index page serves just fine too. I'm going to go ahead and show the terminal so we can see all these requests coming in. And you can see old was a GET request, and then it requested the style sheet, requested a fave icon, which we don't have, requested a index page then, and once again the style sheet, and once again the fave icon after that. But we still have some file types that will be issues. So let's take a look at some of those as well. Say if we went to our data folder, data.txt, well, that seems to work okay, even if we aren't sending the accurate file type with it. But what about data.json? That's just text. That's not really JSON like we would want to send back, even though it looks like it and could possibly be parsed into it. That is not the format that we really want to send. Let's also check our new page because it should have an image on it, and the image doesn't work either. So we have some file types creating problems. What should be working is the redirect. So let's go ahead and type in old-page.html. And yes, it does redirect immediately to the new page, so that's good. And what about requesting something in our subdirectory? And yes, we got our subdirectory index page. So that also works like we expect it to. Let's go back to the data and see if we can fix that JSON first. So data/data.json. I'm going to hide the terminal window for the rest of this and scroll back up to the function that we created, serve file, and I'll go ahead and expand the window once again. Let's start by changing data that we've defined here to raw data, and then let's define data separately. So here we have data, and this is going to be equal to a ternary statement. And we'll look at the content type that we already know, and if the content type is equal to application/JSON, then we'll have a true value that follows the question mark, and that true value will be JSON.parse, and this would be parsing the raw data that has been read. Otherwise, the false value would simply be the raw data. Likewise, when we send the response, and we're going to need an extra line for this, so we'll just do it on a separate line and keep the parentheses up here and down here. Now, what we need is another ternary statement here, and we'll look at the content type once again. We'll say if it is equal to application/JSON, make sure I spelled JSON correctly, then we're going to have a true and a false, and the true would be JSON.stringify, and we can go ahead and pass in, oh, not the raw data, the data, And otherwise, it's just going to be data that we send. Oh, and I don't need that semicolon. That would cause an error. And we can save our file. Let's go ahead and resize Visual Studio Code and reload our JSON. And now we can see it is served in a much more expected manner here. And this is truly JSON that has been stringified. And of course, it was parsed to begin with. Now let's go back to new page where we have a broken image, and we can fix that as well. So right now we definitely get our new page HTML, but the image doesn't come through. Now this is because the image would not use UTF-8 encoding. I'm going to expand Visual Studio Code again, and let's go ahead and put these values on separate lines as well. And now we can close out the parentheses down here on a separate line too. Now we still want the file path here, but instead of just UTF-8, we're going to start out by saying if the content type, and that is not, so we'll say if it does not include, but we're using includes here, and we're looking for the word image in the content type because both the PNG and the JPG had the image in the content type that we have down here in our switch statement, and you can see it right here. Okay, so we're looking for that to see if the content type includes image, and if it does, or if it does not include image, I'm sorry, because we have the exclamation mark, that means if it does not include, it would be UTF-8. But if it does, let's just put an empty string, because a string is expected in that spot, but if we don't specify, then it will go ahead and let the image go through. So now we can save this and go back and check our new image page. Let's go ahead and reload it. And we've got our image. Now that we have the cute dog image, there is one more change we need to make as I expand this. And if you have thought about this, we're sending a status 200 even when it's a 404, because the 404 processes through here as well. So we need to check. We don't want to send a 200 if it's a 404. So right now in the right head, let's go ahead and break these out as well into separate lines. Just gives us a little more room to work and see everything that's happening. So now instead of just saying it's a 200 status code, we can say if the file path dot includes once again, and if it includes 404.html, well then we know it should be a 404, and else it should be a 200. So once again, a ternary statement, just determining the status code between a 200 and a 404 here in our function, and we can save that. And now we are close to being finished. We are serving all the files and they are having the correct content type header sent with them, but we haven't logged anything yet. So let's go ahead and remove the comments here and let's copy each one of these. And first let's take where we're going to emit from before we handle the listener. And as we do that, we'll scroll up here to see the server. And right after the console log, where we're looking at the URL and method, would be a good place to emit. And we're going to emit a log, but what we want to say here is a template literal instead of that generic log event emitted that we had. And we'll go ahead and pass in the request URL. And then after the request URL, we have a tab delimited log file, so we'll put in a tab. Then we'll put in the request method, and after the request method we'll go ahead and put a comma because we're going to add another parameter to our log event handler. And so now what we want to say is which file we want to put this log to, and this will be to the request log.txt. So we can save that one, and we'll go ahead and copy the emitter one more time because we also want to put the emitter up in the error where we could catch a server error, and here we'll log something different. So instead of request URL, this is going to be the error.name, and instead of a tab here we're going to have a colon and a space, and then we can put in the error.message, and we're going to go ahead and log this to the error log.txt, and we can save that too. Now let's go back and grab that listener that we need. And we get rid of these extra lines at the bottom. You can see we've used just about 100 lines even. And let's go ahead and get rid of one of the lines here, because by the time we finish, we will have 100 even that way. Now, where we'll put this is right between the emitter and the port, and we will be listening for a log. But instead of just a message, we're also going to have a file name passed in. And then here, we'll take the file name in the log events function as well. So let's save that too. But we need to go back to our log events function, and here we can say it's really the log name, so let's say log name, and we need to replace the event log that we used as a generic example last time for log name right here. And with that saved, we should be good to go. So let's go back to the server just to have it pulled up, and I'm going to open the terminal window again. And looks like we're already running on port 3500. So let's switch this over. And now let's reload our new page. And we got several things here, including the log statement, because I believe we're still logging those to the console. So that's kind of cool. Let's look in our logs, and I'll make the terminal window smaller. And here's a request log. So we got a request, we got several requests in, and we logged exactly what we were getting, the request URL and the method. And they're all GET methods, they're all GET requests. So what about an error? Well, we're going to have to create an error. So let's do something simple like change something we know is wrong. So where it says read file, let's just remove the E off of read file. We'll save, NodeMon will restart the server, and when we reload, we should definitely get an error. Yes, and we logged the error to the console because that's part of our function. We didn't get a page served because we crashed with the error here, or at least it caught it, and that's what we should do. Let's look at the error log, and this is what we would want to check out if we had a problem. It tells us, of course, the date and time, it's the stamp, and there is the error name, a type error, and there's the error message. fspromises.readFill is not a function, and that's because we had a typo with read file. So we can go back and fix that. Now being in and all reload, and we got our new page again. Of course, we can get our index page as well, and everything seems to be serving as it should. Now there are some issues here as we look at our typical request log file. What really stands out is these are all GET requests. We didn't put anything in our code to handle any other type of request, really. We just assume the request method is GET. And of course, we would have to put in more checks to see if it was a post or a put, or what we might want to do with the information and interacting with a database. So there could be a lot more to it, but this is a dynamic server that will serve the typical files you would have with a website, and even some data files that we have as far as data's JSON and text file here. Now, Express.js makes this so much simpler, but this gives us a lot of context to think about and what all goes into creating a web server. So I think you will appreciate Express.js that much more once we begin to work with it, now that you have created a web server with Node.js only. Here we're at the web page for Express, and you can see the definition of Express. It is a fast, unopinionated, minimalist web framework for Node.js, and this is found at expressjs.com. Now you need to have Node installed already and be able to use npm, and then you can add Express to your project, and as it shows here, it shows npm install Express and then -- save. You no longer need that, and you can actually just type npm I Express. Today we're going to reference some documentation, not from the Getting Started link, but from the guide, and go to the routing page. And this way you'll know how to find the documentation for what we're going over today. Let's go to Visual Studio Code. In the last Node.js tutorial, we built a web server using only Node.js. I'm going to start with the completed code repository from that tutorial, and that's what you see right here in Visual Studio Code. But if you don't have this repository, you should be able to easily follow along without it, or you can download or clone it from the starter source code link that I'm providing in the description below. Okay, I'm looking at the package.json file for the repository. Now, if you just downloaded or cloned the repository, you're still going to need to install the dependencies. Not that we're going to use all of these today, but if you just want to get the repository up to where we are, you could go to the terminal from the terminal menu and choose new terminal, or you can use Control and the backtick. That's what I use in Windows. Mine defaulted to PowerShell, and that's not what I want. Let me switch that over real quick to Git Bash. That's what I expected it to be. And once I have a Git Bash terminal, you would type npm install, and this will go ahead and update all of the dependencies, or install them if you don't have them. So I'll go ahead and do that as well. And you can see it will just check my dependencies here. It shouldn't take long, and when it's finished, I'll know I've got everything installed that would be in this repository. So currently I have nodemon as a dev dependency, UUID and date-fns, which stands for functions, all installed as either a dev dependency or a regular dependency. Now what we want to add is Express. So we'll type npm I Express. We don't need the -- save. That's understood at this point. So we want to install Express as a dependency. And it just takes a few seconds, and Express should be added, and you can see it here in my dependencies listed between date-fns and UUID. Now, just to update a couple of things for this tutorial, I'll switch the name to 06tut instead of 05, and instead of Node.js web server tutorial, I'll just put Express tutorial in the description. But those are minor changes and nothing that you actually have to do. I just wanted to go ahead and update that. Let's move over to the server.js file where we'll make the rest of our changes today. Now, much of what is here, and I can close the terminal as well, much of what is here we don't need anymore. So if you want to make a copy of this file, or if you want to rename the server.js to oldserver.js or something like that to save this code in your repository, go right ahead, because we're going to get rid of most of it. We need to keep the path requirement, the path import at the top, and then I'm going to remove everything else down to line 12 where we keep the port definition. And then I'm really going to remove everything for now except where we listen here at the very bottom on the specific port. Now we can go ahead and make some changes. Right at the very top on line 1, let's go ahead and import Express. So we'll define Express and we'll set it equal to require Express. After that, let's define app. Now we could use another name here like we've used server, but typically you'll see examples using the word app, so that's what we'll go ahead and define as well. And you set it equal to Express, and you call Express. And so now we can use the app where we've been using server. So we'll have app.listen at the specific port that we have provided. Now we'll use path later. It's the only thing we haven't used up to now. And now let's come down a couple of lines and we can define our first route. So we use app, and then we specify the HTTP method that we want to route. So we'll use the get method here. So any get request that comes in that looks for just the root, this would be our index page, then we can specify what to do with that. And This takes an anonymous function here, or a function. It doesn't have to be anonymous, but this is what you would typically see and what I will do. And so now what we do with the route, it happens right here inside this anonymous function. So let's start out very simply, as you might expect, and let's just say response.send, and then we can say, well, let me use a single quote just because I like to better, hello world, and that's what would be sent in response. And so now we can go ahead and start the server, and we will expect to get this at the index page. Now, to start our development server, if you remember, as we specified in our package JSON, we can use our dev script that uses NodeMon. So NodeMon knows to restart anytime we make changes. When we save our file, it will identify those changes and it will restart the server JS. So let's go ahead and open our terminal again. And with the terminal open at the bottom, I'll type npm run dev. And it should take just a second, but the server will start up and we expect to see that server running on port message inside the terminal window. Let me drag this up and see what we get. There we go, server running on port 3500. So now we'll go to Chrome and open up Chrome. Let's open a new tab and let's go to localhost, and we've got port 3500. And we get a very small hello world that is simply delivered in text. Okay, let's minimize Chrome and let's drag the terminal down so it doesn't take up quite as much space, but we'll keep the dev server running. But let's go ahead and serve our index file that we have in the views folder now. We do have an index.html here. Instead of just sending hello world, we can send a file. And you do that with res, which is the response, send file. Now inside of send file, there's a couple of different ways we can specify the file to send in Express. One is to put in the path, say ./views/index.html, and then we can provide options, and one option is to specify the root directory, and this is where we can use that dir name value that is native to Node, and this will tell Node and Express exactly where the root directory name is, and then inside the root directory we would look inside of views, and there we would find the index file. So this should provide the file. Let's go ahead and save, and it says it's restarting due to changes. Once the server restarts, we'll bring Chrome back up, and now that we've got it, let's reload. And now we've got our index page, and I'm going to resize Chrome so we can just see it and the console when we want to, at least when I pull Chrome back up, if I can get it to drop down. Not that we really need the whole thing, we don't have much content here, but we've got that. So now I'll go ahead and minimize and pull it back up again when we need it. So that is one way to do it. Now let me copy this down so we can just leave that in commented. And the other way to serve a file is what we're already used to doing in Node, and that's why I usually do it this way, is we can use path.join, and then we specify the directory name, and then we join in the views folder, and then we go ahead and join in the index.html. And this will work in the same way. So let's go ahead and save this. And now let's bring Chrome back and we can reload, and we should just get the same result. And we do, we still have the index page. So that is more how I would do it because I'm used to using path.join, but you could do this either way. Okay, in the file tree we can see we also have new-page.html. So let's just highlight all of this, and I press Shift Alt and the down arrow, and I can just copy all of it down, and then we'll remove the commented outline, and then we'll change our app.get route here. So instead of just looking for the root, we're looking for new-page.html. And upon that request, of course, we want to switch this to new-page.html as well, and save. Now, let's go ahead and look at Chrome and see what we get if we type in our new-page.html. So we have /new-page.html, and we get the new page. So that works just fine. So we can tell that we're not just intercepting the route right here, because this is only looking for the slash. So even though this has a slash, this does make it past, and this is okay. We get new dash page .html instead of stopping right here, because this does read this down like a waterfall. So it would check this route first, but now we know it does make it to this route. However, if you have the same question in your mind that I would, you'd be thinking about, what if somebody requests this slash index.html? Well, this is where Express really helps us out, because Express also accepts some regular expressions in the routing. So instead of just saying slash here, we can specify, and we can say this must begin with the slash and this must end with the slash, and then we can say or, and then we can also say slash index.html. So if that request comes in, it will route also to the index.html. Let's go ahead and save that, and once again look at Chrome, and now let's switch back to our slash without the index, and now if we go ahead and put slash index.html, we still get the index. And if you remember, when we built the Node server, we also made it so you could just type in index without the .html. Let's see what happens if we do that. Oh, we get cannot get index. So that means it could not find that page, and this is what Express returns by default if it's a 404 and cannot find that. And it's also worth mentioning where we did a considerable amount of code to handle things like the status code and the content type in our Node.js only web server. Here, Express automatically sets the correct status code and content type. So for that 404, it already set the 404. Likewise for this HTML, and we're sending an HTML file, it already sets the correct content type, and of course it sends a 200 if it finds it as a successful response. And now we can add just a little bit more regex, and that way we can make the .html optional on this request. And if we put the .html inside of parentheses and put the question after it, that's exactly what it does. So let's go ahead and do that to our new page as well. And so we'll put the .html and a question mark after it, making the .html optional in the request. So we'll save both of those. Let's come back to Chrome, take another look, and now index without the .html. Let's go ahead and reload. Oh, and the server's still restarting, as we see down here, restarting due to changes. Let's see if it's going to restart. It's taking just a little bit. May need to restart the server altogether. Do Control-C to get out of that, and then I'll do npm run dev again, and we'll get that server running again. Okay, with the dev server once again running, I'm not sure why it hung up there. Let's go ahead and refresh the page, and now we get our index page with no .html inside of the URL. Something else we handled in our Node web server that we created was a redirect. So let's do that with this Express server now, and I will copy down the new page request. But now if we're requesting an old dash page,